Hello, welcome everyone back to our weekly live stream celebrating our 45th expedition that will be taking place next month. Last week we were joined by our crew, and this week we're joined by members of our science team. So we have Dr. Harley Newton here, our chief veterinarian, as well as Dr. Bob Huter, our chief scientist, who also joined us in our first live stream a couple weeks ago. Thank you for everyone who has joined every week. We're going to get started just talking mainly about our science today. So I'll kind of kick it off if you both want to talk about what exactly your role at OSearch is. And Harley, if you can talk about getting into shark research, a little background on that. Bob touched on that during our first week, so we'll have Harley touch on it today.
Go ahead, Harley, you first.
Oh, sure. So I am the chief veterinarian and senior veterinary scientist. I have my own research, which is largely based on shark health and shark stress physiology, how sharks react to different stressors. But as part of the OSearch team, I'm also largely responsible for a lot of the biological sampling that goes on board. I help to organize the research teams, the scientists. I help to organize all the projects so that we're sampling animals in a way that's really efficient and takes the least amount of sample, exactly what we need for all of the different studies. I make sure it's stored appropriately. I make sure that it goes to the right lab. So I do a huge amount of coordination as part of my job. And Bob?
And my name is Dr. Bob Huter. I have been a shark researcher for more than 4 decades. I'm the chief scientist for OSearch, just overseeing the science program, working with Harley, working with our senior data scientist, John Tominski, working with Paige on communications, working with other members of the staff in education. The communication of science to you all out there is extremely important to us. If it's just us finding, getting these data and then it just kind of stops with us, that doesn't serve any purpose. We want to try to do work that gets out to the public, and that's why we're so happy to be here today talking with you all. And I hope you send your questions to us because we're ready.
Yeah, and I want to start off talking a little bit more about OSearch's science and our approach to science. So, Harley, you talked a little bit about coordinating with different collaborators. Bob, you touched on as well. Can we talk a little bit more about OSearch's collaborative approach and why it's unique to be this collaborative in science?
Well, I'll start, and then we'll have Harley talk about the super importance of the veterinary side and the health assessment that she's particularly in charge of. I know that you all know us through the tracker and through the tagging that we do, and you see the animals moving around, and that's very interesting to me as an ecologist who's worked on shark movements and migration for many years. But we realized early on with OSearch that we were capable of doing so much more. And if we're going to actually handle an animal, let's get the most out of that animal before we put it back into the wild. So we have to handle the least number of animals to answer the most number of questions. And thus began, I would say back around 2016 or so, the building of a collaborative team, not just within the OSearch organization, but among about 30 different other organizations where experts reside, where they do their work, and these are people that needed the kind of data and samples that we were collecting. So what we're doing is a very collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to understanding the biology and the conservation needs of the white shark. And it spins off into a lot of other different benefits. And we think this is the best way to go. So Harley, you want to add to that?
Sure. I think the addition of veterinary science and health assessment to the OSearch project really started in 2016 as part of the Young of Year expeditions, and maybe just prior to that, where we had veterinarians as part of other larger collaborative teams. the purpose of the health study really is to understand better how sharks show issues with health. I was, for a long time, the head of aquatic health at the New York Aquarium. So I was mostly dealing with sharks in managed care. And in that situation, we were getting a sense that, some of the traditional markers that we're used to using in mammals and, even ourselves maybe aren't as easy to tell us the health status of a shark. So really what we're trying to do is understand how sharks show us that they're healthy and to set a baseline for the future, understanding how they're doing now. The other goal of this is really to be able to allow our other collaborators to use health as a tool. So we have collaborators that do a lot of toxicology work. And health is obviously really important when you're looking at some of those markers. If animals are bioaccumulating a toxin, is it impacting their health? So we're really trying to create a situation where we can be really collaborative and help people answer bigger questions with some of their research projects. Paige, you're muted.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about how it's important to create this baseline of data and how you're really coming in and creating this health data and understanding what healthy is for the first time and understanding what markers to look at. Why is that important to create a baseline now? Why is it important to have that information now for the future?
I mean, I think that's true for any of our studies. I think all of our studies are really not just looking at the stressors and other things affecting white sharks and other sharks in their natural environment now. It's because we know that our oceans are changing and we know that they're going to change with time. Creating this point in time now where we understand what things look like now means that in 10 years, 20 years, long after we're gone, we're going to have that information to know what things used to look like and how animals have changed and adapted to deal with the stressors that we know that they're going to experience.
Yeah, for sure, Harley. I mean, baselines are critical in science, and you don't know what the meaning is of something that you're measuring if you don't know what it was in the past and able to project that to the future. We know that the sharks that we're looking at today are not pristine animals. We're not dealing with a pristine situation. It's not a baseline like starting at ground zero when everything was in perfect balance and there was no pollution in the oceans. So we're sort of somewhere along along the path right now. But by establishing these markers, these numbers now, we can actually measure, we can gauge the progress that we make to clean up the oceans and put things back into balance. And the great news is that we are making strides on the east coast of the United States and Canada, an area that's kind of special for rebuilding shark populations and starting to address issues more seriously of things like pollution and now even climate change. And so as these bigger factors come into effect and have their impacts, we're going to be able to compare these measurements that we make in the future with what we see today and hopefully see positive benefits of the conservation actions that have been taken.
Perfect. And now let's talk a little bit about all of the projects that we're doing in our Western North Atlantic white shark study. So we've been in the Western North Atlantic for the last few years, really focused on this population. We've tagged 88 sharks out of our goal of 100 shark. What have those 88 sharks shown us?
Well, we've started to, I should say we're coming to the final stages of assembling what we call puzzle, assembling the picture of the entire life of these animals from essentially from birth to old age. This, believe it or not, even though this is the area where Jaws was set and it seems like such an obvious place to do shark research, the shark population, the white shark population in the Western North Atlantic was relatively understudied compared to other places like the Eastern Pacific, and Australia and South Africa. So we had to play catch up. And since 2016 or so, we've really been focusing on this group. And I forgot the question. I got off onto a tangent there.
No, just talking about our Western North Atlantic white shark study. What have we learned over
What have we
this?
learned? Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Well, we've learned how to find white sharks, that's for sure here. We've learned, we've confirmed where the animals are born, which is off of the Long Island area in the New York, New Jersey Bight. We've confirmed that this is a true nursery for them, that they spend essentially their first summer there before they start to head south with fall migration. We have
And
figured out.
before you move on with that, Bob, we actually had a question about the nursery.
Oh, okay.
Nathan asked, do you feel that there's only one white shark nursery in the Western North Atlantic?
Well, feel is a funny term to a scientist because we try not to tap into our feelings. Sometimes we tap into our intuition, but based on the evidence, based on the data that we have, there's only evidence of one nursery right now, one primary nursery where the animals are born. Now there are things called secondary nurseries, such as where they spend the winter time. And so down south off the southeast, where they're not so concentrated and where they're bigger and they're doing different things. This is an area where juveniles are found as well. Whether we call it a nursery, it doesn't really matter. It's a place where the young sharks are. But the actual pupping grounds, the actual places where they pup, is somewhere in that northeastern area off of Long Island, because that's where these very young pups, these neonates and young of the year show up and are found. But the other thing I'll say as far as the ecology of the population is that what we've done, OSEARCH can really be proud of this, is we've really shown the importance of Canada, Atlantic Canada, to the population. Canada was sort of minimized in the past as being just a fringe part of the range of the white shark in the Western North Atlantic. And our studies indicate that probably around half of the animals in the population go to Canada in the summer and use Canada as their main feeding ground. So that opens up a whole new avenue of issues in terms of working with Canada, this being multinational, not just one population in the United States. So that's among many other things that we've found. And then Harley, what would you say about the health side of things, the physiology of the animals, and the veterinary side?
Sure. So some of the work that's a little more complete, I saw someone asked a question on the side there about the microbiome. We do work with a group that's been studying the microbiome and did publish some work both on the microbiome of their skin as well as their gastrointestinal tract and how that varies between regions, and actually compared it to tiger sharks that we also sampled during some of our trips. We have a number of researchers that are looking at contaminants. We're getting a little bit closer with that contaminant work. I think a lot of the biological work, what we're hoping to do is create a bigger data set for the Southeast. Right now, we've tagged a lot of sharks in the northeastern areas, in particular Atlantic Canada. So having that comparison throughout the whole range is going to be really important for getting that information out there. For the health work that I'm doing, we definitely are seeing that there are some biological markers in their blood, some changes in their white blood cell counts that may indicate that they are having health impacts or stressors. There's proteins that are released by the liver, acute phase proteins, that may be useful in determining that. And we're really seeing that in that there are fluctuations that we're seeing in some of the contaminants that are similar to the fluctuations we're seeing seasonally and year to year in the same animals. So some of that collaborative work is really helping us piece that all together. We're coming up on a few of the dietary studies are getting close to a close. Some of the ones that use isotopes for analysis, that project is complete and they're working on their data. We're also looking at other markers of diet that these animals prefer, both fatty acids in their bloods, as well as looking just at the molecular markers that are in their fecal samples. That's something that we also are hoping to fill out a little more in the Southeast to understand a little more what type of prey they prefer, particularly down here in the Southeast.
As you were talking, Harley, I could see in the comments, we have a lot of friends from Canada watching. So shout out to you guys. We love it there. Absolutely love it there. And obviously our sharks do as well. Thanks for your support.
Yes, welcome from Canada. Also, we have a marine science class too that I wanted to welcome here as well. And now, so as you guys can see, we do a ton of samples when there's a shark on the lift, just like the shark that's behind Bob right there. That's white shark Luna. And just like Bob said earlier, we're trying to learn the most from the least amount of animals as possible. So we have 24 different science projects that we're collecting samples for every time we have a shark on the lift in the Western North Atlantic white shark study. And I just want to touch a little bit before we get into more user questions. Why is this research so important? What are we hoping from this? Obviously, conservation efforts, but why is this research going to help best inform that?
Well, you have to start in science. You start with basic research, which is the importance of just answering basic questions because we're curious. And I'll give you an example of something that we didn't plan on getting out of this work, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the applied side. What we didn't plan was that one of our projects, led by a microbiologist named Kim Ritchie, University of South Carolina, would actually yield bacteria off of our white sharks that in the lab produce novel antibiotics that kill off the bad pathogens like MRSA that we have to deal with in our own health. So that was kind of an unpredicted serendipity sort of an outcome from the research. And by doing research and asking lots of questions, those are the benefits that can come from it. And now Dr. Ritchie is working with a biotech group to try to develop this into eventually a drug that will help you and I. That's an amazing thing. But more in terms of the questions that we really need to answer with this work, we're focused on the fact that since about the 1960s, sharks have been overfished around the world, and that includes off the Atlantic coast of the U.S. and Canada. And so, we've got an unbalanced system. Essentially, we've got a system that needs to be a reset. And so we need to know, what does that mean? How do you do that? How do you reset it? Well, you do this kind of basic research to see what the animals need. And we figured out the critical habitats for them. We're learning more information, as Harley said, about what they eat. And so we have to look at their prey. And then Harley can tell you about where we are with things like the other threats they face from environmental pollution. So the shark is just a piece of the picture. It's not the end all, but it's a critical part. And these sharks are apex predators, so they're very important in food webs. The bottom line is the research is necessary if we're going to have a healthy ocean, and that's the ultimate goal. And we feel good. We feel great about the track that we're on. It was all gloom and doom 20 years ago, and now things seem to be improving. And the reason that they're improving is because the policy changes that are made are based on good, solid research.
Perfect. And one thing I want to touch on again before we get right into user questions is Expedition Northbound. So we're heading back out on the water soon for Expedition Northbound. We'll be off the coast of North Carolina in that lower Outer Banks region from April 17th to May 4th. You can kind of follow along with us on all of our social media accounts. But what are our science goals for this expedition? What would you call a win after this expedition from the science side?
Take it away, Harley.
Sure. Obviously, we're down to the last 12 animals, and I'd say the animals that we really need the most from the biological sampling realm, as well as just from our data set, is adult animals. We need that because we're trying to fill in some real critical questions about their reproductive cycle, when they're active, how often the females cycle, when they might be mating and reproductively active. So that's an important question. As I said before, diet, particularly what they're doing down here during the overwintering period, what they're feeding on, what's important to them is something we really don't know a lot about. I think those are some critical questions. And as I said, really probably the only sort of differences in spikes we've seen seasonally and regionally in some of the health markers has been in the Southeast when we've sampled. So those are really kind of the three, but adult animal, I think for all of the projects is really the primary focus.
Yeah. It's a real challenge too in this area to work at this time because the sharks are there, but they're very spread out. And when we go to Nova Scotia, for example, in the summertime, this is when the sharks have kind of come to specific areas because the prey is there. And it's very different in the wintertime. They're spread out over the continental shelf. So it makes our work challenging. So these last 12 animals, especially trying to get adults, it's like we're down to the really smart ones, and it's harder and harder to get those. So watch our expedition, and if we get, Harley, what do you think, 3 4, certainly if they're all adults, then that's a big win. We hope to
Yeah.
get more. As Harley said, we're at 88 and we're trying to get 100 animals, and we need mostly adults in that last group of 12.
Yeah, and this region traditionally, from a sort of weather standpoint, and certainly the season and the region is very challenging. Most of our expeditions in the Southeast, we have a lot of weather days. I think our previous trip this time of year in the Carolinas, we only got 7 out of the 21 days. And another previous trip, it was 8. So it's definitely a super challenging environment for our fishing team to try and figure out where we can go, where we can work. And it really has so much more just to do with basic Mother Nature.
Yeah. Fortunately, we have a nice big ship, like you can see part of behind me. So it's safe for us, but it's hard to work, it's hard to work on a shark on that platform. As you see where Luna is, if we have much more than 6-foot seas. So that does limit us to the calmer times.
Yes, finger crossed for good weather next month, that's for sure. Okay, so now we're going to get user questions. We'll try to answer as many as we can, but if not, we'll go through later in the day and answer the rest of them. But I wanted to start with a user question that we got submitted ahead of time. We've talked a little bit about the nursery, but Timothy, one of our top fans on Facebook, wanted to ask, how many baby sharks does the female shark deliver when giving birth?
You want to say Dr. Newton, our chief veterinarian and shark deliverer, if we ever...
You can go ahead. I hope not. I'm looking at the side here to see what other questions there are. There's definitely one that I can jump on after.
Well, actually very few scientists have examined pregnant white sharks. So it's only known, it's kind of spotty around the world, but we think it's about a half a dozen, 7 up to maybe as many as 14, but more typically it would probably be in that 7 to 10 pups range. And remember, these pups are, 3.5, 4 feet long, each one of these things. So imagine how big mom is to carry all those. So that's it, and that's all. And the chances of each of those pups surviving is probably scaled to the population. If it's a growing population, maybe the chances go up, but if it's a stable population, you may have 1 or 2 that survive to adulthood. Although being an apex predator, they have a much better chance than something like a cod, for example, that spawns millions of eggs.
And the question I was going to jump in on, there were a bunch of questions just about the semen samples we collect and sort of why we collect those and what we learn from those. So in addition to collecting blood samples to get the reproductive hormone levels, which will give you a sense of the cycle, we do collect the semen samples to see if that semen is also mature, if it's ready for use. So even if they have a semen sample, it doesn't necessarily mean that that semen is ready. So we look at it under the microscope, we can see whether it moves and whether it's progressively motile, so whether it's moving forward. When you have most of the sample that is both moving and moving forward, that means that animal is really reproductively active, and that would be the peak of the cycle. So that's why we take that sample.
And this is something that Harley can do on the ship, because the ship's a big platform and we have a laboratory for this. We have microscopes and other equipment. So it's something you can't do from a small boat, hanging over the side and working on sharks that way, like I've done for most of my career until I came to OSearch. And by the way, collecting a semen sample sounds pretty scary for, with a big white shark, but if the males are in reproductive condition, it's not that difficult. Wouldn't you agree, Harley?
No, I mean, typically if the animals are truly active, you can sort of press in a caudal region on their belly, where they have a sac that collects the semen. It's called the ampulla, and that will, if you can just express it. But we do often use catheters as well to collect kind of a more sterile sample. And I will say there's a team of people that are focused specifically on this research that are on board that do those analyses on board with the microscope.
And we do that collection with all the other samples that we take, measurements we take, tags we put on, in no more than 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes with each shark, and then release them so that they can resume their normal behavior.
Yes. Okay, another question for you, Bob. Rachel's been asking throughout the entire live stream about the Sargasm headed towards the Gulf, towards Florida. Can you talk a little bit about that and what's going on?
The giant mid-Atlantic Sargassum belt. Yeah, this is something worth watching. Over the years, because of a variety of things, including coastal pollution and nutrients going into the ocean, the growth of this floating seaweed, Sargassum, which actually supports a lot of life. So don't think of it as a dead zone. It's actually a very live zone. But when it gets really big, and starts circulating around, and too big for what the ocean can usually take, and if it comes up on the beaches, then it dies, and it's a real mess, and it causes fish kills and a variety of other things. So right now it's stretching from the middle of the Atlantic, I think about 5,000 miles west northwest into the Caribbean and poking into the Gulf of Mexico. I think they're starting to see a little bit of it down in the Keys. We'll have to watch. I think our sharks are going to be okay, because even though our sharks use the eastern Gulf of Mexico in the wintertime, they'll probably more or less be gone by the time this thing moves in, if it does affect the eastern Gulf. But right now, I think the models are projecting that it's not going to come to the eastern Gulf beaches of Florida, which is coincidentally where I live here in Sarasota.
Great, thanks, Bob. And another question that we've gotten a little bit on this live stream, but a lot on the last live stream. Can we talk about how the animal is safe on the lift? How we know that the animal is doing well when it's on the lift? We have monitoring it, and that it is only out of the water 15 to 20 minutes. I don't know, Harley, if you want to talk a little bit about the precautions we take to make sure the animal is safe when it's out of the water.
Sure, and that really is kind of a team event that goes from fishing team to science team to sort of everyone involved, and it honestly starts before the animal even gets to the lift. We've developed a scoring system to assess the animals before they come to the lift to make sure that they should come to the lift. If an animal is having an issue or is in distress, it would obviously be immediately released. Once they come to the lift, we do a number of different things to help them feel calm and keep them safe while they're with us. We cover their eyes with a towel. We're constantly irrigating their skin with seawater so that they stay wet. We have a tail rope which secures them and keeps them still. And then obviously we're constantly pumping fresh natural seawater over their gills. As far as monitoring them, we've got someone at the head. Brett's always at the head, monitoring that irrigation. He's checking for eye reflexes and gill reflexes to make sure those stay the same. Anyone on the science team who's along the belly, which is a lot of people during part of that work, is monitoring for changes in color. And then we usually have DJ, who you guys saw last week, on the tail rope, and he's telling us if there's any changes in body tension or muscle tension. And those are all really important to understand that the animal's still doing well. We do have plans in place that if an animal is not doing well, that we would release it early. We've never had to do that. As far as monitoring after the fact, part of my research is really understanding how these animals do when we pick them up out of the water, because that is a very common question. whether picking them up impacts them in some way. So I'm looking at blood gases at the beginning and the end to understand whether or not we're ventilating them enough, which at this point, these animals are adequately ventilated and they're going through the metabolic changes we would expect for having a normal response to something like this. So there's a lot going on. And that's one of the things that's unique about OSEARCH is they committed really in 2016 to always having a veterinarian on board. And part of that has to do with the health research, but the other part of it has to do with individual patient care. And for every animal that comes on board, they're part of a bigger project, but for the moment that they're there, they're also a patient in my care and any other veterinarian that's on board's care. And we're always prepared to respond if there's ever an issue.
Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, we're the only shark research organization in the world that has that commitment. And we have that commitment because we care so deeply about the animals. In my career, it wasn't something that we were ever, taught or forced to include in our research. But when we started working with OSEARCH, especially after I met Harley and she was starting to work as a collaborating scientist, we said we've got to formalize this and have a veterinarian always on the ship for every expedition, and we've done that. We have that commitment now.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today. We will try to answer the rest of your questions in the comments later throughout the day. Again, follow us for Expedition Northbound, April 17th to May 4th. Dr. Harley Newton, myself, and Dr. Bob Pewter will all be on expedition giving updates and hopefully sampling some mature animals. And join us next week. We're joined by a couple of our other science team to talk specifically about the tracker. So thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.